So the next person I want to talk about is David. And the great thing about David is we get to see David from when he was a little kid all the way to the end of his life. We get to see the full span of David's existence. And I can't think of a person in the Bible who maybe had more highs and lows than David did. And think about David's story. David gets picked to be the next king of Israel, and then he goes and kills a giant. And after he kills that giant, he goes and he gets to hang out in Saul's court with all the other people. He gets to be the harpist for Saul. And it's just kind of this great, lovely existence of a life. And then all of a sudden, it all gets taken away from him. He goes from being in the wilderness to being he goes from being in David's court to being in the wilderness by himself. And what a swing from all the way up here to all the way down here. It kind of reminds me of kind of what our COVID experience has been like. Man, things were rolling so good in so many different ways. And then all of a sudden, the brakes came on and we're in COVID, we're in quarantine. And so today I'd like to talk about David hanging in there. Hanging in there isn't as easy as it sounds. Like, just hanging in there. And other than that one girl in third grade who could always hang in there on the playground, none of us really like hanging for that long. In fact, the longer I hang here, the more uncomfortable it gets. And so just like with David in Scripture, he had to hang in there for a really long time. Things went from really good to really bad really quickly. You know, I remember this story from when I was working at summer camp, and I ended up being hired as a rock climbing instructor at summer camp. I had no idea anything about rock climbing, but the rock climbing director was coaching me along in that first week of camp. We were teaching kids how to do this very thing. We were teaching them how to rappel. And it was this awesome rappel where you would just hang off the rock and float in midair. Your feet weren't on the rock like mine are right now. She was just hanging there in midair, and about halfway down, we heard a little bit of a scream and then some crying. And this girl's hair had gotten caught in her belay device. And I go, all right, what do we do? Just have her go back up. But she couldn't climb back up because there was nothing to climb up. So we had to set up a different rope, and it took about a half hour, and we had to cut her hair off. So I've always been pretty terrified of rappelling. It's scary. It's not fun hanging in there. But that's kind of what we're doing with COVID. We're all just kind of hanging here, waiting for what's next. And for David, this was a really challenging time. Like, it wasn't David's best moments. And if you read through David's story, you see that this was the time when he went and pretended like he was crazy to the Philistines. He went to the priests and asked and kind of stole some of the holy bread from the sanctuary. It wasn't all his best moments, but it was also some really great moments for David. You know, while he was playing harp in those good times in Saul's court, I don't think many of those psalms made it to the album that we call the Psalms. But a lot of those poems and a lot of those psalms, those laments and those praises to God came from his wilderness experience when he was hanging in there. So sometimes those hanging moments are times when we grow. David grew as a leader. He had to figure out how to deal with his family and keep them safe once they showed up, which taught him so much more about being a future king, about keeping the people he loves safe, keeping his country safe. keeping them close to God in the wilderness than he ever would have in Saul's court. You know, when I was learning how to rock climb, I couldn't figure out why rappelling was so much scarier than rock climbing. And then that instructor that I was working with at camp told me it's because when you're climbing up the rock, you're depending on your own strength. And when you're rappelling, you're depending on all of your gear. I'm depending on that anchor that we set up at top. I'm depending on this rope that's holding me here, and I'm depending on this harness that is going to keep me safe. And I think as we hang in there, that's a great lesson for us. It's not about working through our own strength to get things done. It's about depending on the anchor that is Jesus. It's about leaning into the grace that comes from God, and it's about sitting into the comfort of the harness that is the safety of who God is. So, as we hang in there, church, it's a good lesson for all of us to trust God. Trust God that in the end, no matter what time it happens, He will get us through it. In the song that Stephanie is going to sing for special music, there's a verse in that song that I think really applies to this time in our lives, this hanging in there time. And it says this, I feel like David could have written this, even though it isn't a Psalm of David. It says, I love your voice. You have led me through the fire. I've known you as a father. I've known you as a friend. I have lived in the goodness of God. I really think that we've lived in the goodness of God in awesome ways that maybe we don't even see yet.